Phew. Okay, the prayers worked. Okay, I'm gonna do this. Let's see, make sure this works. Okay. Okay, let's go to prayer. Dear Lord, we just pray for Sister Debbie Haggard and family as Debbie mourns the loss of her mom who passed away. We just pray that you would give the whole family peace and be with them in all ways. And we pray for Ed Conges, whose wife Carol passed away. We just pray that you'd give him peace as well. And we thank you for this opportunity that we have to go into your word, and just pray that we would get from it all that you have for us this morning. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we're starting a new book, the book of Ruth, and it's right after the book of Judges that we've talked about. And what's interesting about Ruth is it actually, the events of it happen early in the book of Judges. And the thing is, it could have been inserted there, but it wasn't. God intentionally took that story that happened early in the Judges, put it separate by itself. Why is that? What I believe is that if you look at Judges, here's a people that would follow after other gods, they would not follow God, and then they'd go into bondage for a number of years. The Midianites, the Amalekites, they would cry out to God. God would provide them a deliverer, a judge, and then the cycle would repeat itself. And so, to me, that's a bit negative about how this happened. And then Ruth, on the other hand, is a story of redemption. It's a story, it's got a totally different feel to it. And we believe that it was written by Samuel. We don't know that for certain, but that's what we think. And Ruth is the first of two books named after a woman, and the other is Esther. So let's see if I can get this working here too. So this morning I was thinking about what do Esther and Ruth have in common? And I came up with some similarities between the two. So like I said, Ruth is the first of two books named after a woman. The other is Esther. So both Ruth and Esther were risk takers on behalf of others. Ruth was willing to take a risk and go with Naomi and follow her God, and do so much more, and to go off to a place that was not her home, a religion that was not her religion, a God that was not her God. So she was willing to take a risk. Esther was also willing to take a risk. She put it all on the line to try to save her people, the Jews, from annihilation. And both were fully committed. I see Ruth, and we'll see what she says to Naomi about how my God is your God, my home is your home. She was committed. She was looking forward, not wanting to turn back at all. Esther was fully committed too. So Esther could have lost her life. This was one of the most powerful men in the world at the time, King Ahasuerus. And she didn't know how it would come out, but she was willing to risk her life on behalf of the Jews. Both faced consequences for non-performance. So Ruth faced a life of poverty. There were no men at that time that she and Naomi went back to Bethlehem. And so they didn't know how they would provide for themselves. Esther could have lost her life. Both faced rewards if successful. We'll find out in the story of Ruth that the reward is she married Boaz. He provided for her. He was the kinsman redeemer for her. Esther was able to save the Jews in the Babylonian or in the Persian province. Another thing that I thought this morning that was true of both of them is that in both cases, God orchestrated events so that both of them were exactly in the right place at the right time. You know, if Ruth had come back earlier, it may not have happened. If Esther had gone into Ahasuerus sooner, things wouldn't have worked out the way they did. But God has a way of just working things out so that you're in exactly the right place at the right time. Another thing I noticed is that both Esther and Ruth were both virtuous women. We'll find out that the people of Bethlehem spoke really highly of Ruth, and that Boaz found out. He told Ruth that he had heard from all the people in Bethlehem that Ruth was a virtuous woman. And Esther, of course, was virtuous in that she was willing to take the risk of saving the Jewish people. You know, we look at the men of the Bible and we see their flaws, but I couldn't find any flaws that were mentioned about either Ruth or Esther. Not to say that they didn't have them, but it's God wanted to emphasize how he was going to use them. Okay, Ruth was a Gentile. She was a Moabite. And we're going to look on a map in just a moment and see where Moab was. But basically, Bethlehem was to the left of the Dead Sea. Moab was to the right or east of the Dead Sea. And so this whole story took place between Bethlehem and Moab. In one case, she's going from Bethlehem to the land of Moab. In the other case, she and Naomi are returning back to Moab. And there's different routes to get there. The one that she probably took would be about 76 miles. And those were hard miles, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Trying to get this clicker to work. Okay, so the writer was unknown, but thought to be Samuel, according to the Jewish Talmud. So if Samuel is the writer, it would have been written after Samuel anointed David the king, but before he became king, since Samuel died before David became king. So it would have been around 1050 BC. The reason we know it happened after David was anointed is that in the 4th chapter of Ruth, it mentions David. So obviously it must have been sometime around the time of David when it was written. Okay, so the location was mainly Bethlehem, but as I said, it was going back and forth between Bethlehem and Moab. And we mentioned that Ruth fits in somewhere early in the book of Judges. Now, the way we know that is because Boaz in the story, do you know who his father and mother were? Rahab. And Rahab was where Joshua and the people of Israel entered the promised land, and Rahab was a prostitute in the city of Jericho, and she hid the spies, and then she was protected by Israel. When Jericho was destroyed, she and her whole family were brought out, and we have every indication that she became a follower of God. And she married Boaz's father, Salmon, and then, so that's what would place Ruth as early in the book of Judges. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Okay, then we said that Rahab and Salmon are the parents of Boaz. So Boaz's mother's Rahab, the same Rahab mentioned in Joshua 2, who was the prostitute who saved the Jewish spies. So the thing that I find interesting is that how God can use people in a number of situations. He can take people that have been steeped in sin, he can redeem them, and they're washed clean. It's like they had never done that. So we're going to find out something about the Moabites too that would not be a very savory thing. And yet God was able to use Ruth and Boaz in spite of the background of parents or their ancestors. So I think my back arrow's not working the way it is. Daniel, we just blanked out here. Okay, so I'm going to mention about racial tolerance at the time of the story of Ruth. So at the time of the story of Ruth, early in the time of Judges, interrelational interaction was accepted at the time of the story. But never again in the history of Israel would there be this level of racial tolerance. So the author obviously had no compulsion or compunctions about Ruth, the Moabitess, being included in Jewish circles listed in the genealogy of a king. This comfort with outsiders could have been common during the life of David. He had a tender heart toward the foreigners, going to them for advice and military support, even entrusting his own life and the lives of his parents to their care. So as a foreigner, Ruth was welcomed into her new country, Israel. She was free to marry an Israeli, and God included her in the lineage of Christ. So what I find interesting is that we use that term grafted in. Ruth, as a Moabitess, was able to be grafted in to the body of believers of God, just as we, being Gentiles, are able to be grafted in to the body of Christ.
Tom, you made mention of something about David having a heart, towards or a tolerance, whatever you want to call it, towards foreign people outside of Israel. If you think about that, especially in the story of Mephibosheth, which Mephibosheth was not outside of the nation of Israel, he was a Benjaminite. However,
Okay, so here's what I think is an application that we can learn from this aspect, that God will never deny access to anyone who longs to know him. And his message will always be available to every seeking individual. So on the way to Sunday school this morning, I was listening to a podcast about a lady who is a missionary in the Netherlands for 30 years. And she was able to witness to Muslims. And we think, well, particularly if we look at radical Muslims, it seems like they're just the antithesis of Christianity, the gospel, and yet the Lord is able to save even them.
Yes.
And he's been appearing to them in dreams, visions, and Iran has been a hotbed of the gospel. And there's been, I heard a report that there's over 1 million Christians in Iran right now. So God will never deny access to anyone who longs to know him.
And there's a Christian uprising in Iran taking place right now.
Yeah, so we really need to keep them in our prayers. So we see a thread of God's participation in Ruth's life. We see the famine, which caused the family of Naomi and Elimelech to travel to Moab. And then we see the marriage of Ruth to her Naomi's son. We see the death of her husband, the death of her brother and mother-in-law. And then we see that God showed Ruth where she should glean, because it was not arbitrary at all. And then we see God just putting Ruth in Boaz's field of view so that he was attracted to her and was, even when he was not aware of the relationship.
We never know the circumstances that God's going to bring into our lives to move us to another place, do we?
No.
You know, my mother-in-law flipped off the Fords backwards. And well, I've spent 3 years of my life almost up here to really get taken care of. But the best thing about it, and I praise God every day for this church, I have been more blessed in this church than my attendance in that house in many, many years. And I praise God for Grace Baptist Church just for the opportunity. But if my mom-in-law hadn't have flipped off that back of that Fords backwards, I would have never got an opportunity to come up here and participate. If you can understand the depth of God.
So you can see the hand of God moving in that situation to put you right there in that pew.
It's like Naomi had a family. We saw God's plan with
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, so an application is that God is sovereign in all aspects of our lives. So even when we make wrong choices, God can turn it out to his glory, his good. He can work with that. You know, we hope we don't make wrong choices, but when we do, God is still sovereign to all those that are called according to his purpose. And here's a verse about that.
But you also look at where that Ruth came from. You know, Moab, the way that the country started, you know, Lot's, how it started is to incest relationship with his two daughters. And Moab was one of the cities, and God called it his washpot. Yes. Moab was just a bad, bad place.
Yeah.
And you look at when they took off with their two sons, but how that God used this bad place, this washpot, to pull up. And that's the way God does us. We're actually the Gentile people. You know, and He's has pulled us out. The whole story of the book of Ruth is it's amazing how that God takes people that are not worthy, and how He grafts them in, and how He can bring them into His family.
Yeah, just to use an analogy, going along with what you said, Philip, is it'd be like us deciding that things were getting bad here, so we moved to Afghanistan to get away from what's going on here. And here's Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. Okay, continuing the story in verses 2 and 3. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his two sons Mahlon and Chilion, Epaphrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her two sons. So that I can't even pronounce it, Epaphrathites were dwellers of Bethlehem. Epaphra was another name that they had for Bethlehem. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her two sons and her husband. So when they came to Moab, it was to escape the famine. And it was only supposed to be temporary. They said, well, once the famine is over, then we'll come back. And so they probably didn't think it would be 10 years. Maybe they thought it would be 5 years, something less than what they ended up staying.
Which is another lesson in itself, that the perspective can be made, or the argument can be made from this perspective, is that they're in Bethlehem, which is house of God, house of bread, and they left because of the famine. And so how many times do we leave God because of a famine, and we say, well, it's just going to be temporary, and we turn around and we've been out of God's will for 10 years.
Daniel, can you advance it? This clicker's not working here. There we go. Okay, let's back up one.
Which, like Brother Phillips said, God used all of that. And that's, again, I'm like him, I'm amazed at how God took them and how he used that bad situation and how he worked in Moab and brought forth life out of that washpot. Boaz
Yeah.
was a great man. He's the only mention of the kinsman redeemer in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
He's the only time that that's mentioned. But he is a great illustration of Jesus as our kinsman redeemer. He is the illustration.
So something that, if you just read the Bible on a surface level, you hear all these interesting stories. You hear the story of Ruth, Boaz, but there's a depth to the Bible that goes much deeper than just that surface level. There's a lot of typology in the Bible, where somebody is a type of Christ. We're going to get into a little of the typology, not today, but another lesson. But there's so much depth to the Bible that So there was famine in the land of Judah, where Bethlehem was located, and the way the crow flies, it's not that far from Bethlehem to Moab. It's across the Dead Sea. But for all they knew, there could have been famine in Moab also. So that's what makes me think that there's different causes for a famine. One obviously is because it hasn't rained, and there's just things get dry, the crops dry up. But it can be there can be other reasons too. In countries of Africa, for instance, a lot of the causes of famine are political. So, like in the case of, if this story happened at the time of Gideon or before Gideon became a judge, think of what the Midianites, they came and raided Israel, and they would just steal all the crops. And so that would certainly create a famine-type conditions if, even though Bethlehem was the breadbasket of Israel at the time.
And I tend to think that that's when this takes place.
That's what I think too. Yep.
When they came in and they just devastated the land, they destroyed all the crops. There was no means of sustenance
That's what I think too. So as we said, possible causes for famine, lack of rain, political. And another reason is that God sends famines to discipline his people. And so it could have been a combination of political and God allowing this to happen for his purposes. So the Bible doesn't mention how long or how widespread the famine was, but it caused a hardship for this family, so much so that they decided to move to Moab. So here's a verse in Ezekiel. Son of man, when the land sinneth against me by trespassing grievously, then I will stretch out mine hand upon it, and will break the staff of the bread thereof, and will send famine upon it, and will cut off man and beast from it. So what was going on at the time? Well, Israel was involved in idolatry, following after other gods, not following the commandments of the Lord. And so he had every reason to bring about famine, to try to discipline them, correct them, bring them back into a more right relation with him. And we mentioned the possibility that the Midianites were eating all the food and stealing the wheat harvest. And so there was not hardly anything left at all for the Israelites. Here we see this in Judges 6, 1 through 3. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. So it was probably during this 7-year period that when they moved out. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains and caves and strongholds. And so it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites and the children of the east, even they came up against them. And the children, let's see, the same one. And they encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth till they came into Gaza and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor ass, for they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude, for both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it. And Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. Okay, so here's a map showing where the location of Bethlehem and Moab. And you can see the arrows show the route to and from. They would have gone around the north end of the Dead Sea. And some things that I found interesting is Bethlehem is an elevation of approximately 2,500 feet. So here they are way up here in Bethlehem. In order to get to Moab, they had to descend down the mountain into the valley of the river that flowed into the Dead Sea. And where the Jordan River came in was about 1,300 feet below sea level. That's the lowest place on earth. Just to put that in perspective, when I lived in California, I went to the Death Valley. And way up on the mountain, there's a mark that's painted, and it says sea level. And it was way up there. And that was about 282 feet. So the Death Valley, the lowest spot is about 282 feet below sea level. So just think how that compares with the Dead Sea, which is 1,300 feet below sea level. And even the Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. So it's way below the elevation of even Death Valley. So here they were at Bethlehem, 2,500 feet, descended down to 1,300 feet below sea level. Then they had to climb back up to the elevation of Moab, which is about 3,200 feet. So now here's the tragedies that Naomi faced. Naomi's husband dies. Naomi's sons marry Moabite women, and then the sons die. So women at the time were very dependent on their husbands and or sons to provide for them. So Naomi, having lost both her husband and her sons, was in pretty dire straits. You know, this was at a time there was no Social Security, there was no food banks, there was just nothing where they could get the help that they needed. And so it would be a very difficult situation for them. It was also a time that in those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. They did what seemed right in their own eyes. So we see in the time of Judges, Judges reveals a cycle of godless and reckless morality, followed by bondage, followed by a deliverer, one of the judges, and then this cycle would repeat itself over and over again. Whereas in Ruth, we're not seeing that cycle. So what we're seeing in the book of Ruth is a story of love and redemption. In the middle of all this godlessness of the book of Judges, a positive book stands apart, the book of Ruth. And that's why I think God chose not to put that story in the midst of Judges. He wanted it to be a standalone story after the book of Judges. So these names have meaning, all the names that we encounter. So Elimelech, the meaning of that is, my God is king. Naomi was pleasant or delightful. So we know that later on, after Elimelech dies and her sons die, that Naomi didn't want that name anymore. She wanted to be called Mara, which means bitter. But I can imagine that she probably fit that name, that she was, early in her marriage when she had her sons, she probably was pleasant and delightful. I think that's why Ruth was so attracted to her, that she would be willing to stay with her. She turned out to be a good witness on Ruth because Ruth wanted to follow her God. And so I bet she was delightful. Okay, now her sons, Mahlon meant weak or sick. Kilian meant tired or dying. So can you imagine having two sons that were sick and dying? Sick and tired? So why would you name your sons that? Unless God put it in their hearts that, hey, it's going to fit this story if we call your son sick and tired. So we find out that both of the boys, after being married, we don't know exactly how long they were married to Ruth and Orpah, but it could have been close to the 10 years. But both boys seemed unable to father children, and before very long they both die. And just, can you imagine the boys talk to their parents in unison? We are sick and tired of not having anything to eat. Okay, the name Bethlehem is named after two Hebrew words which mean house of bread, like Pastor Josh said. Wheat was harvested there, and it was considered the breadbasket of Israel at the time. It was ironic that in the house of bread, there was no bread. That's why Elimelech and the family moved to Moab. Again, an application is that God can use adversity to correct us and bring us to a point of humility and submission to Him. In this life, God does not seek to shield us from pain and suffering and death, as we see. He does seek to enable us to become genuine disciples of Christ. If we are open to the possibility, we can learn obedience to Christ in the midst of our suffering. And that was a quote from Robert Bailey. Okay, here's some other meanings. So Orpah meant fawn or gazelle. Ruth, her name had the meaning friendship. And Boaz, in him is strength. So an interesting little aside that I found is these names were not always pronounced the way we think they were. So Ruth, for instance, in Hebrew would be root, like the word root, like the root of a tree. Moab was Moab, so it's not pronounced the way that we do. But Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. She and her daughter-in-laws, prepared to return home from there. How are we doing on time? Getting pretty close? All right. So now Naomi and Ruth are getting ready to travel back to Bethlehem. When Naomi heard that the Lord had visited her country by giving them bread, she decided to return home. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. And she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with thee unto thy people. So that's really not what you say to a bitter woman, is it? Just those daughter-in-laws just truly, genuinely loved her, and they were willing to go with her. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would you tarry for them until they were grown? Would you stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. So here she's trying to talk them out of going back. And so she is able to talk Orpah out of staying with her, but not Ruth.
And yet when God steps in most of, when we think we're the lowest, and we don't have a chance, just like she said.
Okay, we'll probably try to wrap it up with this one. We still have a ways to go in chapter 1. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave to her. Naomi was her daughter-in-law's only link with the true God. Even so, Naomi tried to convince them not to go with her. The girls wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and left, as Naomi had encouraged her to do, but Ruth stayed with her. So there's... Okay, we found out that, as Brother Philip had said, that the Moabites were children of incest, that the daughters of Lot thought that they wouldn't be able to find any husbands, so they had a sexual relationship with their father, and there were 2 boys. So one of the boys was named Ben-Ami, and they became the Ammonites. And the descendants of Moab, the other son, were the Moabites. So I don't know if you can see that too well, but the kingdom of Ammon is northeast of the Dead Sea. That's the kind of gold-colored territory. Moab was directly to the east of the Dead Sea, and then Edom was south of the Dead Sea. So the Moabites worshipped Shemash, who I believe was a fallen angel that masqueraded as a god, but he was the god of the Ammonites and practiced child sacrifices. And then we found out that Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the abomination of the children of Ammon. So you can see that even we need to guard ourselves against deception, because even Solomon, who is considered the wisest person ever, fell into idolatry and built temples for these fallen. So because of this, so we'll end with this. And I've got a funny little story to end with. Ruth went to Naomi. What happened to Orpah? So Orpah went on to become this television mogul with millions of followers. And the true story is that Oprah's mother, tried to name her Orpah, after Orpah in the Bible. But on the birth certificate, they mixed those two letters, so instead of Orpah, it came out Oprah. And so the mother just went along with that and said, okay, well, you can be Oprah and not Orpah. But it's a true story. But no Moabite to the 10th generation was even allowed to the house of the Lord, not even the court area. The Moabites were considered an inferior people to the Jewish people. They had a very tainted past. The redemption is that much more wonderful when you realize how tainted their background was, and yet out of that tainted background came Ruth. She was redeemed, and we'll get into the rest of the story as the weeks go on. So thank you, everybody. We're going to end it right there. So let's close in prayer.